On October 6, 1995, a 15-year-old girl cycled into the darkness of an ordinary Dutch morning and never came home. And what followed was not just a murder case, but a 30-year struggle between truth, memory, science, and doubt. In this Myth Vault documentary, you will follow Nicole van den Hurk's final journey, the discovery of her body weeks later, the collapse of early investigations, the shocking confession that misled a nation, and the controversial deoxyribonucleic acid evidence that finally named a killer decades later. This is not a story that reveals itself quickly, and every chapter adds a new layer of tension. Stay with Myth Vault until the end, because the final verdict changes everything. Subscribe now and press the bell icon to stay inside the truth. The most unsettling crimes do not begin with screams or chaos. They begin with routine, and that is what makes this case so disturbing. Nicole van den Hurk did nothing unusual on the morning she disappeared, and that normality is the first reason this story refuses to let go of the public mind. A teenager cycling to work before sunrise, a city still quiet, and a route she had already traveled many times. All of it felt safe, familiar, and forgettable. Yet within hours, that ordinary journey would turn into one of the Netherlands' most painful mysteries. As you listen to this chapter, remember that every major development later in this case is tied to these first unnoticed moments, and the questions raised here will echo through courtrooms decades later. Nicole van den Hurk was born on 4 July 1980 in 𝐃𝐨𝐿 Germany under the name Nicole Tegmeyer. Her early childhood was shaped by movement and change rather than stability. Her mother, Angelica Tegmeyer, entered a relationship with Ad van den Hurk, and together they moved to the Netherlands, where Angelica married him and Nicole took his surname. This change of name and home gave the appearance of a new beginning, but family tensions would quietly follow. In 1989, the marriage ended in divorce, and Ad van den Hurk was granted custody of Nicole, a legal decision that would later draw intense public attention as investigators examined every personal connection in her life. By April 1995, Nicole's world was shaken again when her mother Angelica died by suicide in Tilburg. At only 14 years old, Nicole was already carrying grief that many adults struggle to process. At the time, she was living with her grandmother in 𝐃𝐨𝐿, trying to maintain a sense of normal teenage life despite deep emotional loss. Just months later, October arrived, bringing with it the early morning shifts of a seasonal holiday job at the Wensel shopping center in Eindhoven. Nicole accepted the job willingly, eager to earn money and independence, and she cycled to work alone in the early hours. On Friday, 6 October 1995, Nicole left her grandmother's home before sunrise and began cycling toward her workplace. She never arrived. Hours passed before concern turned into alarm. By 6 p.m. that evening, police discovered her bicycle submerged in the River Damel, an image that instantly transformed the case from a missing person search into something far darker. The placement of the bicycle suggested intention rather than accident, and investigators knew immediately that someone wanted the disappearance to look confusing. Days later, on 19 October, Nicole's rucksack was found near a canal in Eindhoven. The discovery intensified fears and expanded the search area. Police began searching the canal and its southern bank, while tips flooded in from across the region. By 20 November, hundreds of tips had been logged, ranging from sightings to rumors, each one demanding attention while offering little clarity. The investigation team worked under mounting pressure as public concern grew and the media began tracking every development. Then, on 22 November 1995, a passerby made a discovery that confirmed the worst fears. Nicole van den Hurk's body was found in wooded land between Mierlo and Lierop. She had been outside for nearly 7 weeks. Her funeral on 28 November drew approximately 1,000 mourners, a powerful reflection of how deeply the case had touched the public. The autopsy revealed a fatal stab wound to her ribs, fractures to her jaw, and injuries to her head and fingers, evidence of a violent and personal attack that erased any lingering hope of survival. From that moment, the investigation shifted entirely toward identifying who had intercepted Nicole on that ordinary morning and why they had acted with such brutality. The simplicity of her routine became the most haunting element of the case, because it suggested opportunity rather than planning, chance rather than long preparation. And as the investigation unfolded, the lack of clear witnesses would become one of the greatest obstacles, allowing suspicion to move freely without solid ground. As this chapter closes, one question hangs heavily over everything that follows. If Nicole's disappearance happened during a routine journey on a familiar route, how did no one see what happened, and how did the killer vanish without leaving an obvious trace? In the next chapter, you will see how early investigative missteps, anonymous calls, and false leads began shaping a case that would spiral into confusion and accusation. The silence of that morning would soon be replaced by noise, but not by answers. When a body is found, people expect clarity to follow. But in this case, discovery only deepened confusion and fear. Nicole van den Hurk's death did not bring closure. It opened a door to uncertainty that would remain open for decades. The early investigation unfolded under enormous pressure, with police racing against time, public fear, and a growing sense that crucial moments had already slipped away. Every decision made in these first weeks would shape the entire case, and some of those decisions would later be questioned in courtrooms and media studios alike. As this chapter begins, understand that what investigators failed to see was just as important as what they did see, because the absence of witnesses and clear evidence created a vacuum where speculation and suspicion would thrive. In the days following the discovery of Nicole's body on November 22, 1995, investigators focused on reconstructing her final hours. The crime scene, located in woodland between Mierlo and Lierop, offered limited physical evidence due to exposure to weather and natural elements over nearly 7 weeks. This delay severely complicated forensic analysis and limited the reliability of early findings. Despite these obstacles, police pursued every possible lead, driven by intense public attention and the emotional weight of a murdered teenager. On October 24, 1995, before the body was even found, an anonymous man had called the police claiming he could identify the killer. The call ended abruptly before any usable details were given. Months later, in January 1996, a recording of that call was broadcast on national television in hopes of identifying the caller. The broadcast generated attention but produced no confirmed results, leaving investigators with yet another unanswered question, and reinforcing the sense that vital information remained just out of reach. As weeks turned into months, the investigative team was gradually reduced in size. Resources were reallocated, and what had once been a major operation was narrowed to a small group of detectives. This downsizing reflected both a lack of new evidence and a growing frustration within law enforcement. The case remained open, but momentum slowed, and with it, public confidence began to erode. In February 1996, a new claim briefly reignited hope. A friend of the Van den Hurk family, who was under arrest for drug trafficking, told police that he had been forced to smuggle heroin by men connected to Nicole's killing. The statement sounded dramatic and potentially explosive, but after careful examination, investigators concluded that his testimony was inconsistent and unreliable. It offered no verifiable details and ultimately led nowhere, adding another false trail to an already crowded path. Media involvement intensified as time passed without arrests. A magazine called Passy offered a reward for information leading to the identification of the killer. This incentive encouraged tips but also increased the risk of false accusations and self-serving statements. Between May and June 1996, Nicole's stepbrother and stepfather were arrested in connection with the murder. The arrest shocked the public and placed the family under extreme scrutiny. However, both men were later cleared due to lack of evidence, leaving behind emotional damage and lingering suspicion that would never fully disappear. The impact on the family was profound. Grief was compounded by public judgment, and trust between family members fractured under the weight of accusation. For investigators, the failed arrests marked a turning point. The case had become emotionally charged and politically sensitive, making every decision more difficult. Meanwhile, the absence of a clear suspect allowed rumors to spread freely, filling newspapers and conversations with theories that blurred fact and fiction. As the first year after Nicole's death passed, the investigation showed few signs of progress. Hundreds of tips had been reviewed, multiple suspects questioned, and yet no one had been charged. The killer appeared to have vanished completely, leaving behind only questions and unresolved anger. The failure to secure early forensic certainty would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the case, as advances in science would expose how much had been unknowable at the time. As this chapter ends, the case stands at a dangerous crossroads. Police have exhausted early leads, the family has endured suspicion without justice, and the public is left wondering whether the truth has already been lost. If investigators could not solve the case when memories were fresh and evidence still existed, what hope remains years later? In the next chapter, you will see how time itself becomes both an enemy and an unexpected ally, as the case grows cold, only to be reopened in a way no one could have predicted. When a case goes cold, silence becomes its own kind of evidence, and in the Nicole Van Den Hurk investigation, that silence lasted for years. Files gathered dust, memories faded, and the idea that the killer might never be found slowly became accepted by many. Then, without warning, the case exploded back into public attention in a way no one expected. A confession appeared not in an interrogation room, but online, written by someone who should have been seeking justice, not suspicion. This moment would drag the case out of the past and into a new storm of accusation, hope, and disbelief. As this chapter unfolds, remember that confessions do not always bring truth, and sometimes they create a deeper mystery than the crime itself. By the early 2000s, the murder of Nicole Van Den Hurk was officially considered a cold case. In 2004, a special cold case team reviewed the investigation, hoping that distance and fresh eyes might reveal something missed, but the effort produced no breakthrough. Years passed with no arrests, and public attention slowly drifted elsewhere, even though Nicole's family continued to live with unanswered questions. In 2011, everything changed. Nicole's stepbrother, Andy Van Den Hurk, who had by then moved to England, published a message on a social media platform claiming responsibility for her killing. The confession was immediate and shocking, reigniting national interest and reopening emotional wounds for the family. British police arrested him on March 8, 2011, and within weeks he was extradited to the Netherlands to face questioning. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the long search for answers was finally over. However, the confession quickly began to unravel. Investigators discovered that the social media post was the only evidence connecting Andy to the crime. There were no witnesses, no forensic links, and no corroborating details that could withstand legal scrutiny. After 5 days in custody, he was released due to lack of evidence. The public reaction was divided, with some believing he had escaped justice, and others questioning whether the confession had ever been genuine. Andy later withdrew his confession and accused his father, Ad Van Den Hurk, of involvement, a claim that intensified family conflict and public speculation. In a 2016 interview, Andy offered a different explanation, stating that he had falsely confessed to force authorities to exhume Nicole's body so that modern forensic testing could be performed. This claim cast the confession in a new light, transforming it from an admission of guilt into a calculated act aimed at reopening a stagnant investigation. Following the confession, a new cold case team was formed in early 2011. Investigators approved the exhumation of Nicole's remains in September of that year to collect new biological samples. This decision marked a turning point, as advances in forensic science now offered possibilities that did not exist in 1995. Around the same time, the reward for information was increased to €15,000, prompting a surge of new tips from the public. Within a week of the exhumation, police announced that foreign biological material had been discovered on Nicole's remains, This revelation confirmed that the killer was not someone whose material had previously been identified, shifting the focus away from family members and toward an unknown assailant. More than 20 new tips were reported, and for the first time in years, investigators felt that the case was moving forward rather than circling old ground. Despite renewed hope, uncertainty remained. The biological material had been exposed to the elements for nearly 7 weeks before Nicole's body was found, raising concerns about contamination and degradation. Investigators knew that any conclusions drawn would face intense scrutiny in court. Still, the presence of foreign material provided a concrete lead, something the case had lacked for decades. As attention returned to the investigation, media coverage intensified once again. Every development was analyzed, every statement dissected, and every family relationship re-examined. The confession that was meant to unlock the truth had instead exposed how fragile truth can be when evidence is incomplete and emotions run high. What mattered now was not who spoke the loudest, but what the science could prove. As this chapter comes to a close, the case stands on the edge of transformation. A false confession has reopened old wounds but also unlocked new possibilities, and the exhumation has delivered evidence that could finally identify the killer. Yet doubt remains because science does not always speak clearly, especially when time has damaged what it is asked to explain. In the next chapter, you will see how advanced forensic analysis and expert testimony become the battlefield where guilt and innocence are argued, and how numbers, probabilities, and human judgment collide in the search for justice. When science enters a courtroom, it carries the weight of expectation, because people believe numbers do not lie. Yet this case would prove that numbers can confuse as much as they clarify. After years of silence and speculation, the Nicole Van Den Hurk investigation reached a point where biology replaced rumor and probability replaced memory. The evidence now came not from witnesses but from microscopic traces left behind decades earlier. Traces that had survived weather, time, and human error. This chapter marks the moment where justice depended not on emotion but on interpretation, and where expert voices would argue over the same data while reaching different conclusions. As you move through this chapter, remember that forensic science is powerful, but it is never simple, and the truth it reveals is often contested rather than absolute. After the exhumation of Nicole Van Den Hurk's remains in 2011, investigators focused entirely on biological evidence recovered from her body and clothing. 3 samples had been collected originally in 1995, 2 from the genital area and 1 from her underwear, and all were considered highly vulnerable due to prolonged exposure and early collection methods. Advances in forensic science offered new tools, but the condition of the samples meant that every result would be debated fiercely. Laboratories in the Netherlands and abroad were asked to analyze the material, and several independent experts were consulted to ensure accuracy and transparency. These specialists applied probabilistic genotyping methods, which use statistical modeling to interpret complex mixtures of genetic material. The results revealed 2 clear male genetic profiles, one belonging to Nicole's boyfriend at the time, and another belonging to an unidentified man. In addition to these profiles, analysts observed genetic peaks that could not be conclusively attributed, raising the possibility of contamination or degradation rather than the presence of a third individual. Investigators compared the unidentified profile to known offenders, focusing on cases with similar methods. This process led them to a man later identified publicly as Joost de G, who had previously been convicted in multiple sexual assault cases involving young women and bicycles. On January 14, 2014, police arrested him after his genetic profile matched both the semen sample and mitochondrial material found on a hair recovered from Nicole's jacket. The arrest marked the first time in nearly 2 decades that the case had a suspect supported by forensic evidence. When the case went to trial in 2015, the courtroom became a battleground of scientific interpretation. Prosecutors argued that the probability calculations showed overwhelming likelihood that Joost de G was the source of the unidentified genetic material. The defense countered that the mixed nature of the samples and the presence of genetic material from Nicole's boyfriend undermined the certainty of the conclusions. They suggested alternative explanations, including consensual contact days before the murder and the possibility of unknown contributors. Expert witnesses from different institutions presented conflicting interpretations of the same data. Some emphasized likelihood ratios favoring the prosecution, while others highlighted uncertainty margins and the risk of overstating conclusions. Judges and lawyers were forced to navigate complex testimony, while remembering that the ultimate question was not scientific perfection, but legal certainty beyond reasonable doubt. In November 2016, the court delivered a split verdict. 𝐃𝐨𝐜𝐿 was found guilty of rape but acquitted of manslaughter, with judges citing unresolved uncertainty surrounding the genetic evidence and the sequence of events leading to Nicole's death. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, a decision that satisfied neither the prosecution nor the victim's family. To many, the verdict felt incomplete, as though justice had paused rather than concluded. The prosecution immediately appealed the acquittal, arguing that the totality of evidence, both forensic and circumstantial, supported a conviction for manslaughter. During the appeal process, higher courts revisited the scientific testimony and re-examined the likelihood of alternative explanations. Over time, confidence grew that the ambiguous genetic peaks were the result of contamination or degradation rather than additional contributors. By October 2018, the appellate court overturned the earlier acquittal and convicted 𝐃𝐨𝐜𝐿 of both rape and manslaughter, increasing his sentence to 12 years. The decision reflected a shift in how the evidence was weighed, placing greater emphasis on probability and consistency rather than absolute certainty. As this chapter ends, the science that once divided the courtroom begins to solidify into judgment, yet questions still linger. Did justice arrive too late to heal the damage? And can probability ever truly replace certainty in the eyes of those left behind? In the final chapter, you will see how the highest courts weighed these questions, how the case finally closed, and what the story of Nicole van den Hurk reveals about memory, truth, and the cost of waiting decades for answers. Every long investigation reaches a moment when questions must stop and judgment must begin. And for the case of Nicole van den Hurk, that moment arrived after more than 20 years of waiting. By the time the highest courts reviewed the evidence, grief had aged, memories had faded, and public anger had transformed into exhaustion. Yet the weight of what happened on that October morning in 1995 had never disappeared. This chapter represents the final reckoning, where legal authority attempted to bring closure to a story that refused to rest. As you enter this final chapter, understand that verdicts do not erase pain, but they define how history will remember a crime, and how a society decides when doubt has finally been overcome. After the appellate court convicted 𝐃𝐨𝐜𝐿 in October 2018 for both rape and manslaughter, the case moved toward its final legal stage. The defense continued to argue that uncertainty surrounding the biological evidence should prevent a definitive conclusion, while prosecutors maintained that the cumulative weight of forensic and circumstantial findings supported the conviction. The focus now shifted away from investigation and toward legal finality. In June 2020, the highest court reviewed the case and upheld the 12-year sentence. The judges concluded that alternative explanations for the genetic material were highly unlikely when examined alongside tactical investigation findings and expert analysis. With that decision, the case of Nicole van den Hurk was officially closed, not because every question had been answered, but because the law determined that the threshold for guilt had been met. For Nicole's family, the ruling delivered a form of resolution that had been delayed for decades. It did not return what was lost, nor did it erase the years of suspicion, public scrutiny, and emotional strain. Instead, it offered recognition that a crime had occurred, and that responsibility had been assigned through a process that demanded patience and endurance. The long delay between the crime and the final verdict highlighted how deeply time can shape justice. The case left a lasting impact on Dutch society and the legal system. It demonstrated both the power and the limitations of forensic science, particularly when evidence is degraded by time and environment. It also exposed the danger of false confessions and the harm they can cause to families already suffering from loss. Most importantly, it showed how cold cases can be transformed by scientific progress, even when success is uncertain and contested. Nicole van den Hurk became more than a victim in a criminal file. Her story became a reference point in discussions about investigative persistence, ethical responsibility, and the balance between probability and certainty. The image of a teenager cycling to work in the early morning remains one of the most haunting symbols of vulnerability and randomness, reminding the public that violence often interrupts life without warning or reason. For investigators, the case reinforced the importance of preserving evidence and revisiting unsolved crimes with humility and openness. For courts, it emphasized the challenge of interpreting complex scientific testimony while maintaining legal standards. And for the public, it served as a reminder that justice is not always swift, but it can still arrive, shaped by time, technology, and perseverance. As years passed after the final ruling, Nicole's name remained present in discussions of historic cases, not because of sensationalism, but because her case captured the tension between human memory and scientific reconstruction. The silence that once surrounded her disappearance was replaced by a documented narrative that would endure long after the courtroom doors closed. As this chapter draws to a close, one final question remains for every listener. Does justice mean certainty, or does it mean reaching the strongest truth possible when certainty no longer exists? In the ending of this documentary, we will look back at the full journey of this case, the documented sources that confirm its reality, and why remembering Nicole van den Hurk matters even now. Stay with Myth Vault for the conclusion, because the final words are not about a verdict, but about responsibility, memory, and why some stories must never be forgotten. The story of Nicole van den Hurk does not end with a sentence in a courtroom or a file marked closed, because some crimes continue to echo long after the law has spoken. What makes this case endure is not only the brutality of the act, but the decades-long struggle to separate truth from noise, science from speculation, and justice from delay. Nicole was 15 years old when she disappeared on a quiet October morning in 1995. And for years, her name became a symbol of unanswered questions across the Netherlands. The investigation moved through failure, accusation, silence, and finally scientific renewal, showing how fragile early evidence can be and how powerful modern forensic analysis has become. This case exposed the danger of false confessions, the emotional damage caused by premature accusations, and the limits of certainty when time destroys physical proof. It also demonstrated how perseverance, patience, and technological progress can revive cases once believed impossible to solve. The conviction of 𝐃𝐨𝐲 was not the result of a single breakthrough, but the accumulation of years of work, expert disagreement, and judicial review. Justice arrives slowly, imperfectly, and under intense scrutiny, reminding society that truth is often reconstructed rather than discovered whole. Remembering Nicole van den Hurk is not about reliving tragedy for shock or entertainment. It is about understanding how systems fail and how they can improve. It is about honoring a young life by refusing to forget the lessons written in its loss. Her story stands as a warning about vulnerability, about how ordinary routines can be interrupted forever, and about why unresolved cases deserve continued attention rather than quiet abandonment. The facts presented in this documentary are drawn from publicly documented court records, verified journalistic investigations, and official legal decisions that confirm this case as real, investigated, prosecuted, and adjudicated. These are the references used for this documentary: Eindhoven's Dagblad timeline and investigative reporting on the Nicole van den Hurk case in U.NL coverage on arrests, trial proceedings, and appellate verdicts in NL Times, reporting on the 2015 trial, forensic evidence, and final conviction. Official Dutch court documents published via Rechtspraak, NL publicly available Supreme Court decision confirming the 2020 ruling Omroep Brabant archival reporting on the disappearance, investigation, and exhumation, documented forensic science discussions published by national and international media. This story was real. The investigation was real. The consequences were real. If you stayed with this documentary until the end, you are someone who values truth over speed and understanding over headlines. MythVault exists for viewers like you, people who want depth, facts, and stories that respect the victims rather than exploit them. If you believe stories like Nicole van den Hurk's deserve to be remembered accurately and told responsibly, now is the moment to act. Subscribe to MythVault. Press the bell icon so you never miss an investigation. Share this documentary with others who care about real stories, and comment below with your thoughts so this conversation continues. Your support keeps these stories alive, and some stories should never be allowed to disappear again.